Okay, I'd like to share with people a technique I learned when I was in the University of Rhode Island theater program. This is called the Alexander technique. I was taking some acting classes, and in part of the curriculum, they wanted us to take intro to voice and movement classes, which incorporated a specific technique that was developed by an actor, I think maybe a Shakespearean actor from London, I believe. I'm not quite sure. I don't know all the history of the technique, but I found it very interesting at the time, and it's a very simple technique, and a lot of it has to do with just developing good posture, breathing diaphragmatically, and then doing different exercises to release tension in different parts of your body that you don't sometimes you don't even realize are there, and it has a lot to do with just just the way we sit and the way we stand up and where we how we hold our head on our shoulders and that we don't release different like muscles, I guess you could say, or just we hold tension in different parts of our body. Is pretty much the way to look at it, and very simple. It's not religiously based like yoga or meditation or anything, and it's a simple technique to breathe diaphragmatically. So we're always breathing tight, short breaths from our lungs versus down here, diaphragmatically we take deep, full breaths, so that's and it leads to shortness of breath. So if you're an actor on stage and that's how the technique was developed, maybe the gentleman's last name was Alexander, I'm not sure, but anyway, as an actor that had to perform multiple times a week, he found that he was becoming fatigued, and he didn't understand why, and ultimately he decided to figure out how to counter the fatigue, and by way of doing different exercises to prevent that fatigue from setting in. So he realized, geez, my posture isn't very good, and I'm not breathing from from my diaphragm. I'm breathing from little short little breaths from my lungs, and obviously, I mean, you're breathing using your lungs. The whole respiratory process involves your lungs, but like true breathing should be diaphragmatically, from my understanding. So it also helps to release tension that you build up in your chest. You're always like kind of crunched in. And people don't even realize that. I mean, like, and your shoulders, to relax your shoulders and relax your hips, and just different little really basic things that help to just release a lot of tension. It also helps if you're in an office environment, like I work in an office, and to release tension in your body, because if you're sitting for long periods of time, it's not good for circulation, but it's also, um, depending on how you're sitting and depending on how good the support is in the chair that you're sitting in, and you might develop really bad habits with your posture, and it's just not good overall, and it leads to a lot of fatigue and different types of physical exhaustion that can be prevented. So anyway, I wanted to share some of this with you, some exercises, just on YouTube, and basically there's a whole playlist right here. So this is, it's not intended to be used as a substitute for medical services, blah blah blah. So obviously, if you have an issue with any type of exercise, this is very very basic exercise. It's not any kind of workout thing with dumbbells and weights and all kinds of stuff. It's pretty straightforward. So hopefully people like it, and I just want to share that with you. But I found it very rewarding. It was very nice, and it's something that I kept catching myself over and over again. Once I learned, like, oh, I'm holding my shoulders up high. I got this tension in my neck. That's not good. But it's different exercise. Like stretching your neck out from time to time.
The balance of well-being. The Alexander technique. A unique approach to changing your life by changing your posture.
Hello, my name is William Hurt, and it is my fortunate privilege today to serve two undemanding and happy functions. One is to be a student, to let myself learn, to fall back and let an expert teach me. The other is to introduce you to my teacher. Jane Kosminski will demonstrate her understanding of human energy in a technique that can permit any person to discover and utilize an endless resource within themselves. I have the happy job to surrender to an adventure Jane will guide. The brief, exciting trip she and I will take together today was first undertaken by an intrepid, generous, compassionate individual named F.M. Alexander. She will tell us all about that and more. Any difficulty for me is now over, as it is my great privilege to introduce to you Jane Kosminski.
Thank you, William.
You're welcome, Jane.
I guess I better do something to earn that high praise. Let's just notice where you're sitting, okay? And without doing very much, I'd like you to begin to free your neck, to let your head move up. I'm going to bring you a little bit more onto your sit bones. And we're going to allow your shoulders to release out to the side. Great. And float on the rib cage. And we're going to breathe. Fabulous. Now, that's the Alexander technique in part, and that's what we're going to learn about today. It is my joy and delight to tell you about F.M. Alexander, who he was, what he discovered, how it might help you, and then we will do a few things that you can join in on to see if you can begin to observe and work on some of these principles yourself. Frederick Matthias Alexander was a very interesting man. He was born in Wynyard, northwest Tasmania, Australia in 1869, and he died in England in 1955. For some reason, this young man decided to become, of all things, a professional actor. Actually, he had developed a passion for Shakespeare, so off he went to the big city to become a Shakespearean monologist. Almost immediately, he developed vocal problems, and rather serious ones for an actor. He found that he had shortness of breath, and he kept losing his voice, much more devastating. So, he went to the doctor, as most of us would. The doctor examined him, and he could find nothing wrong with his vocal cords. Eventually, there's an anecdote that comes down to us. This is not exactly the way he wrote about it in his book, but eventually he had a rather important engagement, the equivalent of performing for every agent in the city of New York and Hollywood. So following doctor's orders, he did not speak for 2 weeks prior to the performance. But it didn't help. And the night of the event came, he got out on the stage, and in front of a packed house, as the story is told, he lost his voice, and they had to bring the curtain down. Did anything like that ever happen to you?
It's the classic actor's nightmare, you know. I used to have it, the nightmare used to be that I had produced and directed and was acting the leading role in an opera, and I would go out there for the first scene in full regalia, face the assembled thousands and thousands, open my mouth, and nothing would come out of it. But actually, there was something that did happen to me. I used to have pretty serious nerves, I think, as any performer does, at different stages of their career. And there was a time when I would come on, and if it was a particularly verbal role, my lips would start to cramp on me. I mean, literally cramp, and they would they would start to close. They would close so tight that I couldn't get them open. I would turn up stage and try to pry them apart with my fingers and try to get things loosened up. But it was pretty funny seeing me go around trying to make sounds like this. But I used Alexander technique in solving that problem.
Well, this is really interesting. At the time that this happened to Alexander, of course, there was no Alexander technique. He went back to the doctor like most of us would. I probably would have killed the doctor, but he didn't. He allowed himself to be examined again, and again the doctor could find nothing wrong with his vocal cords. So he asked a very interesting question. He said, am I doing something that's causing me to lose my voice? And the doctor was honest. He said, probably. And Alexander said, what? And the doctor said, I don't know. So being of a truly scientific bent of mind, Alexander bought 3 huge mirrors and began to watch himself speak to see if he could discover what he did and where he might be going wrong. It is his process and the conscious use of himself that we call the Alexander technique. Now, the question becomes, of course, what did he discover? This is what he discovered, and I'm going to tell you, it took him 9 years. I'm going to tell you, hopefully in 9 minutes. What he discovered is that every time he opened his mouth to deliver a monologue, several things happened. He tightened his neck, he thrust his head back of the cervical spine, and he hyperextended. He pushed into his rib cage. Would you like to try that? Would you like to try that?
Yes, Jane. Yes, I would.
Go for it. Go ahead. Tighten your neck. Thrust your head back. Push into your rib cage. Say, ah.
Ah. Ah.
It's what, right.
Ah.
You can hear the sound. You can hear the hoarseness. This is what happens to all of us when we try this. And if you do it loud enough and long enough, you too will lose your voice. I have a theory about this. I think he was playing to the second balcony. I think it was the style of acting of the day, and that he was imitating, like lots of young people do, the kind of acting that was popular and exemplary at the time. What do you think?
Enunciatory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very.
So, a lot of tension in it.
A lot of tension in it.
Maybe as an artist, he was more sensitive. So.
I don't know. Anyway, he discovered that not only did he do this activity when this tightening and thrusting and pushing, every time he opened his mouth for the stage, he discovered after an enormous amount of exploration that the same things happened, the same habits of use happened when he opened his mouth to speak to anyone about anything. It was infinitely more subtle, of course, but there he had these same habits of use. Of course, you can see immediately that the first one is going to affect the voice. But the second one was equally serious because of the breath. And the breath, of course, is something without which we cannot be for any activity. So I'd like you to make an experiment for me. I want you to put your hands on your rib cage, any part of your rib cage, and I'd like you to really push your ribs forward so that it's not very comfortable. And I'd like you to take a huge breath. Where does the breath go?
It's all jammed up in here.
Yeah. Do you realize how often people say, stand up straight, and this is exactly what people do?
A lot of soldiers do that.
A lot of soldiers do that. Now, let's breathe in a little more wholesome way. Let's let the rib cage drape down the way it does in the front and scoop up into the spine in the back. So here we are leaving the back, and now I'd like you to take another deep breath. Oh. What do you think?
I got all of that one.
Feel better?
A lot better, yeah. It's 3 or 4 times more capacity and just satisfaction.
I agree. This is very important because we must, I think, agree to include the breath in our awareness. When we include the breath in our awareness and allow the breath to function inside the rib cage 3-dimensionally the way it really does, then we can change how we use ourselves and how we function. Then you might ask yourself, what can I do about this? What am I going to do? I have this information that I do certain things. I may compress, I may push into my ribs, I may do a lot of stuff that is not good for me. What do I do about it? How can I change it? What Alexander discovered was that if, at the very moment when he was about to open his mouth to speak, he could choose not to speak, to pause, to inhibit speaking, and instead he could loosen the muscles of his neck and allow his head to rotate forward and up away from the top of the spine. He triggered a mechanism in the body in which the head moved up and the spine followed. When he did this loosening of the neck muscles and the rotation of the head to allow it to move in the direction of up, he found he could speak without losing his voice. It is this activity or this non-activity that we call inhibition, the choice not to respond habitually. Now, that doesn't mean to be an inhibited person.
What do you mean by free the neck? Is a person not normally free in their neck? I mean, freeing the neck is the tension habitual, and is freeing something that would be an unusual thing to do? You have to.
Yeah, it would. Let me tell you about free the neck. Every time somebody asks me about free the neck, I have to giggle. When I first started teaching, a man came for lessons because his wife wanted him to. As a matter of fact, she insisted that he come. Right away, I knew I was in big trouble. And as a matter of fact, she came, I think, to the first lesson. And I suggested to this man that he free his neck. And he turned, and he looked at me, and he said, "What do you mean, free the neck?" And of course, I had just begun teaching. I was quite startled and went into startled response, took a deep breath, and said, "To free the neck means to loosen the muscles of your neck, to allow the neck to be soft and easy like a baby's neck. So your children have free necks. It's you and I that run into trouble."
What exactly do you mean by forward and up? Is it a large movement, a small one? Is it one that's forced? Is it one that's permitted or allowed? Is it...
Forward means forward in relationship to your spine. So let me give you an example. Take 2 fingers. Pretend that they are an imaginary rod running through your ears. Great. Now, if we take the head up and over that rod and back and down, this would be not a good place to be. First of all, I can't talk very well this way. Second of all, I look very silly. And third of all, I can't breathe very well because my whole chest is collapsed. Now, if we free the neck and allow the head to rotate up and over that rod, this would be forward and up. That's the easiest balancing point for the head at the top of the spine. That's forward and up. It doesn't mean that you can't move your head every place. Of course you can. We're people, and we should. But this is the place where you can get the greatest length up the spine when the head is balanced forward and up. Now, the interesting question becomes, how do you do it? I'm going to tell you. This is fun. Let me introduce you to Blanche. Blanche wears a button. William, I'm going to ask you to please read Blanche's button.
This button does nothing. Can you?
Exactly. In the Alexander technique, we don't do anything. We think. And because of the way our brains are constructed, when we think an image in conjunction with our own anatomy, we can affect change in our musculature, physical change, in our musculature and in our movement. This is one of the principles behind the biofeedback work. This is part of the visualization techniques that people are using today. Both athletes are using visualization technique and terminally ill patients are using visualization techniques. I got it out. It is a vital part of the Alexander work that we think in order to make a change. Now, William, if I said to you, I would like you to imagine your right hand growing out of your left kneecap. The other one.
My left kneecap. Yeah.
Right. We would be here till the millennia, and I assure you nothing would happen. But if I ask you to think an image in conjunction with your anatomy, something may happen. Let's try something. Okay, you can all try with us. Trying not to interfere with yourself. Let's use the downstage arm, okay? Let's do this. Let's just think about the hand. The hand, imagine it to be an arrow falling into the earth. And I'd like you to think of your forearm, like the shaft of that arrow being drawn down by that arrow. And I'd like you to think of your elbow as hail, following the arrow. And after that, I'd like you to think of your upper arm as rain. Imagine your upper arm falling like rain down forever into the earth. Great. Now, if you lift your hand and measure it against the other one, you might have made a change.
A lot.
Now, of course, gravity is working for us. I'm not going to lie about that. And of course, but there's something else to remember. So are our minds, and so is our anatomy. Of course, we have not changed the length of the bones. That would be absurd. But what we have done is increase the space in the joints and increase the habitual resting length of the muscle. This is how we think in the Alexander technique. We think to free the neck. We do rotate the head if it's pulling back and down. We do rotate the head forward and up. But we think to allow the head to move up. So we begin in Alexander with observation. What are you doing? What am I doing? Inhibition, choosing not to respond habitually. And then something we call direction. Direction is composed of the four concepts, Alexander's four concepts of good use. To let the neck be free, to let the head be forward and up away from the top of the spine, to allow the torso to lengthen and fan into width, to allow the legs to release away from the hip joint, and to allow the shoulders to release out to the side and float on the rib cage. When we think our directions using these concepts of good use, we make an enormous change in the body. Sometimes we think nothing's happening. Ha! What happens to a lot of my students is they work for a while and go home to visit family. And they've been thinking their directions and doing their Alexander and noticing and choosing not to respond habitually. And they get home and they know they've made real changes in maybe 3 months. And their families look at them and say, you look different. Did you get a haircut? So sometimes it is not obvious to other people what has been going on, but what is obvious is to the person inside, how you feel, how you function, how you move, even what you look like.
It's like the difference between how this looks and how it actually feels. I mean, to the casual eye, I don't think the movements are that stark.
They're not.
But the feeling is night and day.